Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this lens right here. It's the 35mm f2 from Fuji. Now Fuji actually makes a very nice range of f2 lenses that are very portable, very practical, and also very small yet nicely built. And this is one of them. It's the 35mm, which is the equivalent to the 50mm full frame, and that makes it actually very versatile and portable as well, because it's a very popular focal range, whether if you're doing street photography, portraits, a little bit of close-ups, or event photography. It really goes well with a lot of types of photography. And to be honest, even though I haven't really used this lens for my professional work yet, unlike my other Fuji lenses, but I have been using this lens for street photography, travel photography, things like that. Anything to do with more of like the personal photography that I usually do, just random documents, things like that. That being said, I also am not really light on the equipment that I use, so it has experienced rain before and it has undergone like intensive heat while traveling, things like that. So yeah, in this video it's not really a review video, but rather a video about my thought and also my experience using this lens. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the 35mm, as I mentioned before, this is an equivalent of 50mm, though if you're one of those perfectionists, you will notice that this lens is like 1 or 2 millimeters wider than the actual 50mm focal range. And this lens is actually also 1 or 2 millimeter, well, the result is 1 or 2 millimeters wider than the actual 35mm 1.4 lens from Fuji. So if you're a perfectionist, that's okay, but to me, it's something I noticed, but it doesn't really matter because it's still approximately 50mm. So yeah, but it's been a really practical and very, very portable lens to take with me. So in this video, I'll separate into the pros and cons, and I would also just, it's coming from my experience and how I use the lens. So I hope that this video will also help those, or be somewhat useful to those who are using the lens, maybe in the way that I would use this lens. As mentioned before, I haven't used this lens for professional work yet, but I've used this lens long enough with my normal personal photography and everything, which is from street photography to travel photography and a little bit of portraits. And yeah, it'll just be from my personal opinion, so it's gonna be subjective more than objective. So let's start with the con, because I don't really have a lot of cons, because usually it's positive. And the con is even like not really about the lens itself. It's really about, because I'm coming from DSLR, my background is Canon, Nikon, and yeah, and 50mm, a budget 50mm on a Canon, Nikon, they're usually at around f1.8, and they're also usually under 100 euros, unless if you buy it at the retail store, which is usually between 110 to 130 euros, things like that, at least here in Northern Europe. And this is like a 400 euros lens-ish, 400-ish euros lens, at least where I live right now in a retail store. And yeah, of course you're paying extra for the build quality, and of course you're paying extra for the weather resistant, and in case of Fuji, it also comes with a lens hood, even though it's the only plastic part of the lens that is also actually detachable. But yeah, that's pretty much the downside of this lens that I personally find. Oh, another downside is, even though the focus ring is very smooth, this is actually more about the actual Fuji system, I find, rather than the actual lens itself. Because if you're a manual focus person, you'll know that Fuji manual focusing is not really accurate, or not always on point, in terms of like, if you drag it, it doesn't respond at that very millisecond, which if you're coming from, let's say, a Canon or a Nikon system, even if those DSLR lenses are focused by wire, from Canon and Nikon, they're usually a lot more precise and a lot more responsive. So that is something to get used to. Even if you're coming from the STM system on the Canon side, the STM motor, when communicating with the camera, is a lot more precise than this lens. Otherwise, those are just the negative points. Now let's move on to the positive points. So for the price, yes, it's 400 euros. It's a little bit too expensive for a budget, for for a budget 50mm lens, but then again, you're really paying that extra for the build quality, and also the glass quality is really nice because, for example, something like a Canon and Nikon 50mm, I'm sorry if I'm comparing a lot to Canon Nikon because I am coming from Canon Nikon full frame cameras, and if you're coming down from that route, of course your 50mm is 50mm made for full frame versus this that is engineered for crop frame. And if you're trying to get something like that for crop frame on Canon or Nikon side, you'll never get as high quality of a crop censored glass as you are gonna get for Fuji, because they mainly manufacture crop frame, like they specifically manufacture their crop frame lenses for their crop frame cameras. Canon Nikon does that as well, but they don't put as much effort as Fuji because their main focus is full frame. And it's pretty much, if you compare to the competition, is it expensive? Yes, it's expensive, like if you're using different brands, but if you're only using Fuji, is it worth the price? Considering that there's pretty much no other competitors as of now making mount for Fuji in this quality and in this focal range, it's worth the price. So in itself, it's a little bit of a contradiction, but I can say that it is definitely worth it. Yeah, so let's go on into the build quality first for the positive. So for the positive is, yes, it's metal construction, yes, it is weather resistant, but it's not only metal construction, but the actual focus ring is also very buttery smooth, because on some of the Fuji lenses, like even with my 16mm f1.6, the focus ring is, it's smooth, but it's slippery smooth. And this, yes, it's a bit more precise with the marking and everything, but because of its focused by wire in the Fuji system, there's still a bit of delay. And even though this is smooth, this is easier to actually knock and twist the aperture ring, whereas this is also really nicely controlled. And if you're not looking at the lens and if you're just predicting which aperture you'll be by turning, the pressure of the click, if that makes sense, it's just enough for you to actually work which aperture it'll be if you stop around here or around here or around here. Whereas with this lens, it's just very light click. Of course, in video that can be a little bit more useful, even though there's still click, but this in photography is a lot more useful. I'm coming from the DSLR side and I'm used to working fast. If I roll like this, I know exactly where it's going to stop, or if I roll like this, I know exactly where the camera, well, the shutter or the aperture will stop. So in that sense, as much as I love the analog dial, I don't know what they call these dials, how they feel and everything, but in terms of speed and efficiency, the DSLR actually has it much faster and more efficient, in my opinion, that I can just roll very quickly and I don't need to have a look at the camera to be able to get the right shot with the right settings that I want. So this is what I really love about their aperture ring, that it's very clicky, and also the fact that it has enough pressure that I know that I don't need to look into the lens to be able to know which aperture I'm at. Okay. About the build quality, that's probably enough. And anyway, the actual lens hood that comes with the lens itself is plastic, and that's the only part. And you don't really notice the plastic anyway, because usually you're just gonna look through the back end of the lens anyway. So yeah, that's that. So now into the image quality. So I think that there is some sort of conflict kind of thing. You know, there's the budget option that optically has the same image quality on the Fuji side, the one that they just released, the 35mm f2, but everything is plastic, you know, weather resistant and everything, and you're just paying 200 euros extra or 150 euros extra depending on which region of the world you live in, just for the weather resistant and everything. But the image quality is quite nice. I find that I really like the fact that they find the soft spot or the right sweet spot between too sharp and very sharp. So you can have a very sharp lens, and this again really depends on what you're working with. So like which field of photography you're interested in. If you're doing something a lot with the skin tone and working with portraits or anything to do with skin, you'll find that yes, you'll look for the right focal length that you need. Yes, you will look for the lens that can reproduce the look or the character that you want, whether it's from the aperture or the contrast control that it has, certain elements of the lens that it includes that will actually help you in the type of photography. And especially in portraits, you don't really want too sharp lens. You want sharp enough that you see the details, but you don't want too sharp that you have to spend a lot of time in post editing, like getting away certain scratches, getting away certain wrinkles and imperfections that becomes very pronounced on the images because of the lens that is too sharp. So I find that this lens, the sharpness quality is like really nice, sweet spot where it should be. So for me, you know, even though this is not really a professional use lens, well, I haven't really used it for professional work, but I would be more than confident to use it for professional work. I still find that this lens is a great lens for an overall lens, whether you're into portrait photography or slight close-up, or if you just want to change your perspective from wide to a little bit in between wide and between telephoto, but not too telephoto and not too wide. So your audience or the viewer still feels, you know, they're still in the story or in the scene, but also separate them far enough from not being too involved in the scene. So this is a great lens to go for. And yeah, the color reproduction out of this lens is great. The color fringing is barely noticeable and you can easily fix it in post. The vignetting, if you're really shooting in a really white, like bright white room, like my room, then you'll notice the vignetting a little bit and a little bit of the distortion. But if you're really going outdoor, or if you're going to many other places where it's not just pure white wall everywhere surrounding you, then you know, you will not really notice the vignetting that much, and the distortion, you will actually not notice it at all if you go to those places. That being said, because it's not something that's so noticeable, it's also very easy to fix if you don't like it. And that's what I like about this lens, is that they really paid a lot of attention to the quality of the optics, and it really showed in the images. So again, it's conflicting in the way that, like, if you're coming from the DSLR side of things and looking at their budget option for 50 millimeters, you'll find that the price on this camera, on this lens, is too expensive. But for the quality that you have, even though there's not really a lot of competition for this lens at all, is it worth the price? Yes, it's worth the price. It is overpriced? Yes, it is overpriced. So within itself, there's a little bit of contradiction that I cannot really explain. But if you're coming into Fuji system for the first time, or if you're already in the Fuji system, the price range, I guess, will definitely make a lot of sense. Again, my Fuji system is sometimes for professional, most of the time for personal kind of thing. So I'm not really as heavily invested into Fuji as my Canon DSLR side of things or my Nikon side of things, and so on. So yeah, there's that. The contrast control is the next topic, and this is also something that I have to, like, that I was really impressed about this lens, because usually, depending on the light source you point the lens to, the contrast control, the contrast of the lens can really show its weakness. So a lot of budget 50mm lenses from other companies, Sigma, Canon, Nikon, they really show a huge decrease in terms of sharpness in terms of the contrast quality, that the contrast may start to decrease quite a bit depending on certain lighting condition. And if you shoot a lot into the sunlight, which I do, this lens holds its contrast actually pretty nicely, and you don't really have to do a lot of editing, unless if you like to do your moody editing and everything, but that's a different story. But in terms of like the lens correction and things like that, you don't really need to add a lot of contrast or barely any contrast at all if you're looking for that natural look, because the contrast on this lens is already very good and it does not decrease the level of contrast while shooting against the bright sunlight that's coming into the lens. Whether if you're shooting portraits against the strong sunlight or any sort of event photography that there's a lot of lighting involved, where there are different sort of light source that could lower down the level of contrast in the image that the lens picks in, because it's also about the wavelength of the lights and everything. You know, this lens does a really great quality of controlling the contrast, which leads me naturally into the star effect, like sunburst effect actually. I'm not sure how you call that effect, but I guess I'll call it just starburst effect. Things like that. Whenever you point this lens into a certain light source and you use, like, let's say f10, f11, f13, things like that, and the light source starts to get into the star shapes, everything, typical Fuji characteristics that if you're into those effects, this lens is not really gonna show that much. It's very normal. It's not bad like Panasonic bad, but it's actually normal. It's nothing to be excited about. It's normal. But yeah, that's it for the star effect or sunburst effect. I don't know how you call that effect. But yeah, overall I actually recommend this lens. If you find yourself not needing the actual build quality because you're shooting a lot indoor, or if your budget is very limited and you're only caring about the optical quality, then I'd say the budget version, which is 200 euros cheaper or 150 euros cheaper, depending on which part of the world you live in, that the XC version is also nice. Again, the optical quality is the same, so I heard, and so I've read and checked, but I haven't used that lens because it's so new. But for me, there's also no reason to really use that lens because even Fuji said it's the same optically, so there was no motivation for me to use it. So take that as a grain of salt, but yeah, that's that. But on the long run, I would still recommend this lens because it's such a versatile lens and practical lens. It's so light, you can just take it anywhere with you, and there's pretty much always no reason to not take it with you because of how small and light it is. And if you're just putting, let me just get the lens cap. If you're just putting the lens cap in front of it, it's just pretty much the size of the lens cap. And like, you know, it's that small. Whether it's just the main lens on the camera or it's the side lens you're taking with you, it's still no excuse not to take it and everything. And oh, let me touch upon video. I haven't really used this lens for videography yet, but in photography, you know how it hunts a little bit before getting into focus? Like, it doesn't hunt a lot, but just a tiny bit, fraction of a second before it gets into the spot. With this lens, in videography, it's a little bit more pronounced. The time it spends on slight hunting gets a little bit more pronounced, and because it's, you know, motion picture, like it's actually a movie, that movement is actually more noticeable when you watch it back, like when you watch it again in post. So unless if you're really confident about your manual focusing skills with this lens, which I'm personally am not, then you might want to look elsewhere for manual focusing with video, things like that, or just buy an adapter and look at some of the older Canon lenses or Nikon lenses to mount on here and use manual focus that way. It's going to be much smoother and it's going to be more precise because it's literally mechanical focus control, and if you get the electronic adapter, you can also control the aperture. And it would probably still be much cheaper because there are a lot of secondhand budget options for Canon and Nikon lenses that still has great quality that will still work with modern cameras. Well, modern camera sensors as well. So yeah, anyway, that pretty much wraps the whole video, and I don't want to go into so deep detail about it because it's only really my opinion based on my experience about this lens and everything. So yeah, there's that. There's really no reason not to get this lens in my opinion, but if you're really under a budget, you can always look at the budget option, which is like the XC version for like 200 euros. If you wait long enough, there should probably be already some secondhand option available for 150 euros maybe, give or take, depending on where you live. So yeah, there's that. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free. It's on my website. I will not ask you for email addresses nor send you any newsletter nonsense. Yeah, thank you so much for watching, and stay safe and have fun shooting. If you need if you want to ask me any questions, please leave it down below and I'll do my best to answer it, or feel free to send it to me via Instagram messages or through YouTube, things like that. Otherwise, have fun shooting and see you next time. Bye.